Great to be here, and what a wonderful packed house we've got. So thank you very much for coming along and showing your interest and support. It's really brilliant. Just thinking about the last couple of things that Olivia was talking about, and psilocybin research, and some of the issues that seem to beset researchers. I seem to remember Rick Strassman at the University in New Mexico, who started and completed his DMT spirit molecule research in the early 90s. Basically had to curtail his research program after starting on psilocybin research because the subjects were just completely unmanageable, and basically were checking themselves out of the hospital right, left and centre, and really being very difficult to deal with. So I can totally sympathise with Olivia on that basis. So I expected actually to see a rather antagonistic, quietly sort of aggressive audience, but I have a horrible feeling that you guys might actually mostly be on side. And so what I'm going to have to do is I'm just going to have to imagine that you're all deep skeptics, and I'm going to have to convince you that what we have to offer is really worth pursuing. So on that note, I'll start off. So I'm going to start with a very seemingly simple question: can drugs be medicines? And of course, given the semantic complexity of both the word drugs and the word medicines, then there are several layers that we could approach this from, several levels, I guess. And so you could even turn the question around: can medicines be drugs? And in fact, I remember hearing a statistic within the last couple of days that in fact in Victoria last year, I think there were more fatalities from prescription medicines than there were from illicit drugs. So that's sort of food for thought. But to me, it's quite self-evident in the context of psychedelics and psychiatric type medication that, of course, psychedelic drugs can be medicines, can be used as psychiatric medicines, because they're both basically doing more or less the same thing. Psychedelic drugs act, as Olivia and also Melissa and Dean were saying earlier, on a series of receptors, neurotransmitter receptors in the brain, just like the psychiatric medications that are commonly used do. They don't necessarily act in exactly the same way, but fundamentally the mechanisms are extremely similar. This fellow, Paracelsus, was, I'm sure, not at all well known globally in his time, but he's actually been quite well known since. He came up with a fairly interesting, I guess, fairly common sense sort of proposition that effectively poisons are in everything, that anybody can be poisoned by enough quantity of any compound, be it a drug, be it water, be it whatever. And he also had insights into medical practice. So he basically said that the healing comes from nature. It basically comes from within. And it's, again, fairly evident to me that self-healing is really a major part of the healing process, and that this somewhat accounts for placebo effect as well. So really our capacity to identify our own issues and then for our own systems to work positively towards rectifying them is really fundamental to the healing process. As Dean and Melissa were discussing earlier, there's a long history, in fact there's a far longer history than they mentioned, of psychedelic or psychoactive drug use in culture. So on the left side of the slide you can see Native American use of mescaline. The centre picture is the Bwiti tribe in West Africa using ibogaine or Tabananthia boga preparations. And then on the bottom left we have a more contemporary use of ayahuasca in a ceremony in the Amazon. But the history of formal research in the 50s and 60s, as was alluded to earlier, is also fairly extensive, to the extent that there were thousands of publications which were released in the 50s and 60s before the curtailment of formal psychedelic research. And this is just a very small sample of them. But as I'm sure you're aware, historically, things got a little bit loose, tiny bit colourful, a few bus trips across the US, bit of peace, love, understanding and respect. And so, not surprisingly, psychedelic drugs, psychoactive substances in the recreational setting came to the notice of authorities, and particularly because, in the 60s, they were part of the countercultural movement. In fact, that carried through in the 70s into the 80s with MDMA. The authorities and the conservative end of society felt very much under threat by the mind states that were being promoted, I guess, by the use of psychedelic drugs. So, not surprisingly, I couldn't believe how many guns seemed to come into these pictures, but not surprisingly, the response was fairly heavy-handed and has continued to be so. And the statistics in terms of incarceration that were shown by Melissa and Dean before are quite staggering in the US, up to just under 10% of the population, I think. Between 8 and 10% of the adult American population is finding itself in jail. Not necessarily all to do with drugs, but there's no question that a significant majority do. However, we hope that we're seeing the beginnings of a renaissance in drug research, psychedelic drug research, both from a clinical standpoint and, of course, from a fundamental basic science research standpoint as well. And so these are the major sites around the world that really focus or figure in this psychedelic research renaissance. And we're hoping that perhaps one of these days, locally, we might be able to add a little gold star to our neck of the woods. The leaders in the psychedelic research renaissance, of course, have been the people associated with MAPS. MAPS was started, as mentioned earlier, by Rick Doblin in 1986. And its brief, really, its self-given brief is to act as a research and an educational organisation. They also have interests in harm reduction, in terms of festival harm reduction at Burning Man and other events around the US in particular. And also they've become very adept at advocacy in dealing with government departments and authorities in gradually changing hearts and minds around the US and globally. I have to say that's a very young and sprightly looking Rick Doblin as well. He's not looking quite so fresh-faced now, but he's certainly still got the spring in his step, and he's an amazingly dynamic and an articulate and persuasive person for anybody who has met him. I'm sure they'll agree. Another major research institute has been the Heffter Institute, which has a much lower profile, and I'd forgive you for not having heard of the Heffter Institute at all. It has much more of a basic research brief, and it comprises a number of very eminent researchers, including Professor David Nichols, who has also been involved, along with previously Alexander Shulgin, in developing quite a number of the new generation of intensely psychoactive serotonergic psychoactive drugs. And Dennis McKenna is another member, and Franz Vollenweider, of course, is another board member of the Heffter Institute. And so between the MAPS and Heffter have really set the pace globally for psychedelic research, both, as I said, in clinical and in basic scientific settings. And we've at PRISM we've been very fortunate to have contact with both of those organisations, and we hope to be able to maintain very fruitful relations with both of them as time goes on. So, on that basis, we've had those organisations plus a couple of others working very positively for about 10 to 15 years on the following compounds, and these research programs have really co-evolved with a gradual, perhaps a gradual change in the perspective, in the policy of certain organisations. Certainly not the Drug Enforcement Administration in the US, but the Food and Drug Administration is a very interesting one that Rick Doblin in particular seems to have found some allies in the FDA in the US, and that has permitted really quite groundbreaking research to take place. And of course the MDMA for PTSD research program is a very good case in point there. So psilocybin has been used as Olivia mentioned before for a number of conditions, and there's a couple more here as well. Quite recent research at Johns Hopkins on addiction to both alcohol and particularly nicotine, and it's being found that psilocybin can have very strong and lasting impacts on substance use disorder. And then down the bottom there's just a brief reference to psilocybin's use for spiritual growth. And that was another research program at Johns Hopkins University, in Baltimore, and it was pretty much the groundbreaking research using psilocybin in human subjects for anything other than a medical condition. It was really trying to gauge the longer-term impacts on a person's sense of internal well-being. And it was established quite, I guess, definitively that a number of these, in fact, a large number of these subjects reported that the psilocybin experience was one of the, say, 5 most significant experiences in their whole life. Some of these might be relatively short lives to date. I'm not sure how old the subjects were. I think they were university students, but nonetheless, I believe that they carried those positive experiences forward with them into later life. LSD, of course, rather nice Alex Gray portrait of Albert Hofmann, is seeing a resurgence as a research tool. And also as a therapeutic tool. And most of my emphasis in this talk will be on therapy, perhaps, rather than basic research. You'll see also that addiction seems to figure fairly prominently in all of these compounds, and so it's going to be very interesting as time goes on to see just how effectively addiction or substance use can be addressed by a range of different compounds, and in fact whether they are exerting different mechanisms or whether there's a similar fundamental mechanism across all of these compounds. I'm not sure how many of you would be familiar with ibogaine as a compound at all, but that's extracted from a natural source, from a shrub from West Africa. And it was used in initiation ceremonies. In fact, these are, as I understand it, these are initiation ceremonies being depicted in this photograph. But somewhat accidentally, an American in New York, a gentleman called Howard Lotsoff, went to take ibogaine recreationally and then discovered that his opiate addiction, his heroin addiction, was actually addressed and alleviated as well. And so that sparked off some very interesting research over a period of time into the 90s and a little bit beyond. And ibogaine has been used therapeutically in clinical settings in some parts of the world for a number of years now. Its mode of action isn't well understood. But one thing that has been quite interesting to come out of that program is there's another compound called 18-methoxycoronaridine, 18-MC, which has similar anti-addictive properties, but it doesn't have the 36 to 48 hour long hard ride that ibogaine is renowned for. And so that has been of particular interest to the drug tsars in the US government, because that represents an opportunity for them to develop an addiction therapy that doesn't involve a trip. However, there are plenty of people who would assert that in fact the psychedelic experience is a major aspect of the curative properties of ibogaine. And that also applies to ayahuasca for addiction and for other afflictions as well. So these are, of course, relatively long and can be rather difficult journeys. And so those difficult journeys can really constitute very strong learning experience as well, both in terms of a self-reflective sort of aspect as well as reflection on how a person's way of life, their actions, can impact those around them as well. And so that's really, I think, part of the great depth of these agents. And so that brings us to MDMA, which, as I understand it, is actually not strictly a serotonergic compound. I'm sure it does have some action at the serotonin receptors, but what it really does is it forces release of serotonin from the vesicles into the synaptic cleft. And it's, as I understand it, the serotonin that's really doing the work in terms of MDMA's experiential or subjective effects, as well as its clinical therapeutic value. So MDMA is characterised as the anxiolytic effects, so reducing anxiety, reducing hypervigilance in sufferers of PTSD, for example. It is a stimulant, as anybody who's had a night on MDMA will attest. It can be a fairly long night. And then empathogen and entactogen, terms that were coined, I think, entactogen perhaps by Dave Nichols, empathogen prior to that, and those are very good descriptors of some of those interpersonal effects. Whether it's a psychedelic or not is another question altogether, and perhaps not entirely of great concern. But it has been brought into the fold of psychedelic potential psychedelic medicines. And so it has been used successfully both prior to scheduling, which was in 1986, and then more recently in the clinical trials that are taking place now, for a number of different behavioural issues, including relationship counselling. There's a research program underway at UCLA, Charlie Grob and Alicia Danforth on people suffering anxiety on the autism spectrum. Anxiety more generally, and of course post-traumatic stress disorder, which is the one which I'll be talking about most this evening. So the program, clinical trials for post-traumatic stress disorder using MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, commenced in Spain actually in 2000, and sadly that trial, which was studying therapy of women who'd experienced sexual abuse or sexual assault, was curtailed by the Madrid Anti-Drug Authority. I don't know who that is and whether they've disappeared without trace, but that study was stopped before it could achieve any significant and lasting results. So 2001 in the US was the first fully commenced and then completed trial in South Carolina, and then there was a follow-up trial very soon after that in Switzerland, in Solothurn, not far from Zurich. And then since then, both those trials have been completed, the original trials, and they've been published. And then more recent trials have commenced and are close to completion. These are all phase 2 clinical trials in Israel and Canada, and there have been follow-up trials in the US as well. So these, as I said, phase 2 trials, testing efficacy as well as safety. They all have been perhaps limited by their small participant numbers, but that's really been a function of cost and complexity of these trials, and the fact that the results of these trials are all being pooled and meta-analysis will be done is a very efficient and effective way of getting around the limitations of small subject numbers. Overall, there have been over 1,100 administrations of MDMA in clinical settings globally, and in particular we're looking at over 130, I believe, in MAPS-administered trials, and there have been no SAEs, significant adverse events, in any of these trials in all of this time. That's not to say that there haven't been adverse events. In some cases, they've generally involved anxiousness, panic, and then sometimes concerns about heart rate and core temperature, but they've all been easily anticipated and then addressed by the researchers. And so, in fact, in the longer term picture, the end of what's called the very significant end of phase 2 meeting between MAPS and the FDA is soon to take place, because they're actually closing off their phase 2 global trials now. They'll be aiming to start phase 3 global trials within the next year and a half, and their objective is to have MDMA available as a prescription medicine for psychotherapeutic use by 2021. Ambitious, I know, but they seem to be well and truly on track. So this is the flagship, I guess, the real archetype protocol. It was developed by the MAPS staff in collaboration with Michael and Annie Mithofer. In this photo, it does appear that Annie is a little dimensionally challenged, but I can assure you that she is a full-sized human being. and a very lovely and caring one at that. So just in a nutshell, you can see that these are the salient features of the flagship MDMA for PTSD trial. It was an RCT trial. The active placebo is an interesting aspect of these MDMA trials, given the difficulty in achieving a double blind, which means that both the participants and the clinicians, the therapists, are supposed to not be able to differentiate between the placebo condition and the full dose. Again, anybody experienced in the field will attest that it can be extremely difficult to achieve a double blind, particularly with a fully inactive placebo. Interestingly enough, back in the Good Friday experiment, I believe nicotinic acid or niacin was used. One of the two was used as the inactive placebo. It gave a sort of a warmth and a flush to the and a sort of a sense that something was going on, which obviously didn't continue to anything actually going on, but it was enough to achieve this sort of blinding. Both on the part of the participants and the researchers. I apologise, I seem to have managed to walk over some of the printing there, but anyway, so the flagship trial included a number of outcome measures, including a clinician-administered PTSD scale, general quality of life and functional measures and so on. And those are a very important part of the trials which contribute to the positive outcomes, I believe, or certainly the convincing outcomes that these trials achieved. So overall, just globally, in that flagship trial, 83%, we are looking at a small sample number, I have to say, but 83% of the subjects experienced on MDMA experienced a significant drop in their PTSD symptoms compared with the active placebo. When I said earlier active placebo, we're looking at 25 milligrams initial dose followed up around an hour and a half later by an optional half dose, so that would be 12.5 milligrams for the low dose. Which apparently is enough to confuse both the subjects and the researchers as to whether a full dose or a low dose has been administered. And then the high dose at 125 milligrams in a drug naive or particularly an MDMA naive subject has been generally agreed to be a pretty solid dose, and in fact it's been found more recently that 75 milligrams is completely adequate for an initial full dose to achieve full clinical or therapeutic value. In fact, the 125 milligram dose is perhaps a little bit counterproductive because people are rolling so hard for the first few hours of the treatment that they do have trouble sort of actually focusing on the therapists. In fact, finding out where they are and then things do follow naturally therapeutically after that, but it takes a while to get things back onto some sort of level. Those positive outcomes were sustained for an extended period of time, up to 4 years after, and this was determined by the follow-up study because contact was retained with all of those original participants. I think all but one responded in the follow-up study. And it has been found that really there are almost miraculous results in these trials, despite the 125 milligram initial dose. In fact, they were offered this half dose, so 62.5 milligrams an hour and a half later, which again would be a good double drop, I reckon. So the Swiss study was interesting in that the results were not statistically significant at 95% confidence by ANOVA, but it was pointed out that it did actually achieve a large effect, and so by some measures it was actually still a successful trial. I think, as Olivia alluded to in the case of the psilocybin trial, dealing with Swiss research subjects can be a little bit interesting as well, so that perhaps there might be a cultural aspect to the outcomes of that therapy. The Canadian study is well completed and the data analysis is well underway, and the Australis study treated its last participant at the end of January, and so those results are being worked on now. So that's the world of the psychedelic frontier as we know it. Where do we fit in? PRISM is, I guess, basically the love child of EGA and MAPS in a way, because EGA, for anybody who's familiar, has been running these amazing and wonderful. I guess I'm a member of Vice President, so I have to say this, don't I? So I'm sure you'll believe me. We have been running quite special conferences and symposia for about 10, 12 years now. And it was at the 2010 symposium, which was at the University of Melbourne, just in the next building, that we hosted Rick Doblin as our international speaker. And we had we had a forum on the Monday just after that weekend of symposia, which was aimed to sort of address the question, could we initiate this kind of research in Australia? And we felt that we do have the skills, we have the enthusiasm, we have a lot of the knowledge, and we have some of the contacts to be able to get these research programs underway. And so PRISM was born. That was in December of 2010, and by early 2011 we had incorporated as a non-profit. And then not long after that we achieved charitable organisation status. So it's called a health promotion charity, and we are able to receive tax-deductible donations. So PRISM got off to a pretty flying start, particularly with the support of MAPS, because Rick Doblin was very intimately involved in that process. Just as a little bit of news for those interested, I'm just announcing that we will be having the next outdoor symposium for EGA in December 2017. There'll be a formal announcement and more details quite soon. It's been quite a while between drinks, but I can assure you it's going to be a pretty damn good drink when we can get back to it. So PRISM got into the business of planning research quite quickly after establishment, and MDMA for PTSD was our flagship study, simply because we'd been so closely in contact with Rick Doblin and MAPS, and we found them to be incredibly supportive, very positive all the way through, and they've been a wonderful help to us. So there's a number of aspects that we had to come up to speed on fairly quickly, because none of us really had a great deal of formal academic research experience. So all of these main factors, so we had to get our plans together. We had to work out how to deal with the organisations that would give us permission and potentially funding for our research programs. The plan to communicate back out into the academic sphere and also deal with the media were things that we had to come up to speed with fairly rapidly. We got our research plan underway quite quickly, and with MAPS assistance we developed protocol MP10, which fits in with their numbering system. We adapted the investigators' brochure on MDMA with the latest information that we had at the time and adapted it to the Australian context. We basically utilised the MAPS resources in terms of things like informed consent forms and the psych measures, questionnaires and so on. And then we came across an interesting question: would we conduct this in a private or community clinical setting, or would we do this within an academic or an institutional context? And the feeling from the beginning is it would be preferable to do this within the community setting, primarily because institutional environments tend not to be terribly conducive to positive outcomes in drug-assisted psychotherapy, or particularly psychedelic psychotherapy. Mainly because in a hospital ward with everything that's going on around, that tends to detract from the more nurturing and caring environment, which is really very critical to a positive outcome. These are just simply what we had to keep on moving with, and just the bottom line effectively is we were looking at about a $350,000 budget for our 14 participants. So that was quite an undertaking, and I have to say that we're nowhere near $350,000 yet. So the protocol was developed 2011. We applied to the one non-institutional HREC in Australia, which is called Bellbury in Adelaide. We were rejected 1 month later, with no particular interest in corresponding into it, which was a bit disappointing for us, rather strange. We basically felt that, and we agreed with the HREC, that the therapist team that we had in mind was not suited to our application, so we made contact with a new therapist team, but that particular individual withdrew interest as well. So we've had an ongoing search for a therapist team, and then we've revised our model to include an academic type setting, hopefully still a nurturing environment. However, our latest efforts, which included getting another application ready for a Human Research Ethics Committee, have been thwarted by institutional risk aversion or conservatism. So that's pretty much where we're at as of this minute. We've put a bucket load of effort in, but we really are not that much further down the track, except for having a very sexy protocol and a lot more experience in how to deal with human research ethics committees. So our developments recently have been much more in the form of communication. We're all becoming reasonably media savvy. We're quite involved in harm reduction and collaboration with formal collaboration with Dancewise in Victoria. We're working on coordinating and moving towards coordinating, facilitating research, perhaps rather than undertaking it ourselves. And we're quite involved, or becoming increasingly involved in advocacy. And research, of course, is still our fundamental reason for existing. So I just thought I'd finish with a couple of sort of moments of reflection. We feel that it's really absolutely critical that psychedelic medical research has a basis in evidence. That really is the mantra of psychedelic medical research. So to achieve that, we should be looking at an academically robust context, preferably with an experienced research team. The randomised controlled trials really need to be very carefully thought out, and they need to be well designed and well funded. And then ultimately leading to peer-reviewed communication. And really, psychedelic psychotherapy is the bottom line. So any of this psychedelic therapy needs to be administered in conjunction with psychotherapy. And then there's a question of risk versus benefit. I had a nice little graph of David Nutt's assessment of relative harms of different psychoactive substances. And these scales of harm really need to come into play, and they really should be our ammunition in terms of convincing the powers that be that this kind of research is beneficial rather than problematic. And so really the bottom line question for us is, do the risks of treatment in the controlled settings outweigh the consequences of the lack of effective treatment? And a very sobering statistic now is that I believe there are as many or more deaths among active and retired military service people by suicide as occur in active duty now. So these are the challenges that we're facing, and we're picking them off one by one, doing what we can. But as I say, as time goes on, we're becoming more experienced and more adept, and it's through the support of yourselves and others in getting the word out that I think we're starting to really achieve a change in a positive shift in the public discourse, and that's really very, very important for us. So some final thoughts. Just because it's illegal doesn't mean it's evil. Many, if not most of these compounds do have long histories of safe use in cultural contexts, traditional cultural contexts, as well as more recent contexts. There's been a deliberate exaggeration of harms over the last 20 to 30 years, to the extent that I think that the general public is actually becoming quite sceptical of the advertising campaigns, which really insult our intelligence in so many ways. And the ethics and, in fact, the morality of blocking research, which could actually benefit people for the sake of some poorly defined, ill-defined ethical arguments, are really, they don't hold water at all. So I'd ask you the question again: Can drugs be medicines? We believe that they can. We hope that here in Melbourne we might become a centre for that. And I'd like to thank you very, very much for your attention.